Aloha! Today we are going to be making 3 different books. We have a saddle stitch, a very simple binding. We also will be doing a chain stitch binding, another simple technique, and then finally we'll be doing a Japanese stab binding. Some supplies that you'll need are some kind of a paper or something for the cover. I'm using a double-sided cardstock for mine. If you don't have cardstock, you can also use cereal boxes or really anything that folds that you can poke holes through. I also will be using copy paper for the inside of my books. I have about 20 sheets here. Other supplies you need will be a ruler, and I'm using an X-Acto knife or a box cutter to cut my paper, and a cutting mat. If you have a paper cutter at home, you can use that too. You also will need scissors, a pencil, and some kind of a thread. I'm using embroidery floss. I find this is a nice thickness for binding. Some other supplies that are beneficial but that you don't necessarily need are an awl or something to poke holes with. If you don't have an awl, that's fine. You can just use your sewing needle, which is a necessary item. So another item is the bone folder. This is helpful for folding the pages over and getting a nice sharp crease. If you don't have a bone folder, you can use any hard edge. You can even use the side of your pencil. I also will be using binder clips to help hold everything together. If you don't have binder clips, you'll be just fine. Another item I like to use is beeswax, and I'll show you what this is for later. And then finally, a pair of pliers. This can be helpful when your needle gets a little bit stuck. So let's begin. Okay, so before we begin cutting and getting everything ready, I just want to talk briefly about grain. Now, I'm not talking about wheat or food, but paper and fabric, a lot of things have a grain or a direction. As you're doing bookbinding, you want to pay attention to the grain. So let me show you what I mean. When you look at just a copy paper, you don't see really any lines to show the direction. But as you fold it in half, maybe just press it down a little bit, you can feel some tension. And when you fold it in the direction that goes with the grain, oh, did you see that? How easy that is to fold? So that means that the grain or the direction of this paper, of copy paper, goes up and down, longwise. Now, when we look at paper that's a little thicker, like cardstock, it's a little easier to tell. So this feels pretty easy. Let's try the other direction and see which direction it goes. Oh, this is a much stiffer fold. Now I'm not pressing it down all the way. I'm not making a crease, but I can tell that it's giving me more resistance this way. That means the direction or the grain line goes this direction. So to help me remember that, I'm going to use my pencil and I'm just going to make a little arrow on my paper showing that my direction goes this way because this is easier to fold. And that's important because when you make the crease or when you fold the spine of your book, then it's going to make a nice even line. If you fold it against grain, it doesn't look as pretty. So this will just neaten it up. I'll mark the same on my copy paper too. Let's see, which direction was that? Oh, this is much harder to press. So that means that this way, the easy way with less resistance, is the direction of the grain. So I'm just going to mark that with another arrow. Okay, and now we're ready to begin. So our first book we're making is the saddle stitch. This is a very good beginning book to make. It just has a few simple holes and it's a really easy technique. So this is again our sample. Now I went ahead and pre-cut my paper. Now we're using the same measurement for both the saddle stitch and the chain stitch. So I went ahead and cut the inside, or what we call the signature, of paper that's going to be on the inside of the book. And both of these just came from a single sheet of the copy paper. So the measurements we're using today are 5 inches tall by 8.5 inches wide. Now if you remember, the grain for copy paper goes along lengthwise. So when we cut it 5 inches tall, that means that the grain is going along the spine because we're just using the width of the paper for our book. So we're just going to set these aside for now, and I'm going to cut the cover with you. So as we remember, the grain direction goes this way. So I'll be turning my book, my cover, so that I can cut 5 inches tall by 8.5 inches wide. Now for my cover, I want it to be a little bit longer in the front of the book than the paper inside it, than the signature inside it. So I'm actually going to cut mine at 8 3/4 instead of 8.5 inches. So I'm going to use my ruler, and I pre-marked some points on my paper. So I'm just going to line that up. And again, if you have a paper cutter at home, you can use that just as well. So I've got it 5 inches up from the bottom. Now I'll just cut. And you want to be careful not to cut your fingers. There's enough going on right now, so let's be careful, right? Okay, so that is now 8.5 inches wide is where I'm going to cut my next line. Okay, I'm just lining that up. And there we have a cover. So while I have my ruler and my knife out, I'm going to go ahead and cut the cover for the second book. Remember, we're using the same measurements for both the saddle stitch and the chain stitch binding. So I'm going to lay my piece on top of the next section. And I'm just going to flip it to the back side so I can clearly see the edges. Now you can see, and you probably couldn't tell before, but I do have my cutting mat down. Now if you have a bigger cutting mat, that works just as well. You just want to make sure that you're not cutting into your kitchen table. So here we go. I've got that lined up pretty straight, but I'm still going to use my ruler to give me an edge to cut against. And again, you can use scissors if you have that at home, or if you have a paper cutter, anything you're comfortable with. There we go. Then we just need to cut that 8 3/4 inches wide. There we go. And there we have it. Move that to the side. Close, and important safety tip, always make sure your knife blade is tucked back in. In case this falls, we don't want any accidents to happen. So we'll move our ruler out of the way, and now we can see we have both of our covers cut and ready. So let's begin with our first book. So I have my paper, and I said at the beginning that you need 20 sheets. So I'm using 10 sheets for this book. So we'll move my cutting board just to the side because we'll need that in a minute. So something you can do is, especially if you have double-sided paper, you can decide which side you want to be on the outside. Now I like this blue and white checked piece, so I'm going to make that the outside of my cover. So I'll put my signature paper or the copy paper on the inside. Now if you tap it together, that helps the paper all line up next to each other. And it should be just about the same height all the way. If not, that's okay too. So now that my paper is kind of centered, I'm looking at the sides too, and I can see that there's just a little bit of space here and a little bit of space here. And that's just the way I want it. So now I'm pinching it on one side, and I'm going to fold it over. Now as you fold it, the paper on the inside is going to move a little bit, and that's okay too. So before I make my crease, you can hear me tapping on the table. That's just to make sure that all the paper stays lined up. So now that I have it, I can see that the front edges meet and they're lined up neatly. I'm going to place it, carefully pinching it on the front so it doesn't move. I'm going to place it on the table, make any adjustments that I think I need, because I want to try and keep that evenly lined up, and I'll just take my hand and gently press it for the first press. And the reason we fold all the paper together is so that they all fit snugly together. If you fold each piece of paper by itself, they're all going to come to a super sharp point, and they don't nest as well inside each other. So this is why we fold it all at once instead of individually. Now at this point, like I said, if you don't have a bone folder, you can just take your pencil and run it along. And this just helps the fold get really nicely. If you do have a bone folder though, same thing, just run along the edge. and put a little pressure on it because you want it to be a nice tight fold. One thing that you do sometimes have to be careful, if you rub too much, you can kind of give your paper a little bit of a shine, which isn't a bad thing, but it does affect the shape and the image a little bit. So now that we have everything cut, we're ready to poke our holes. So I went ahead and I measured out my holes in advance. So I took a scrap piece of copy paper and I cut it down 5 inches, so it's the same height as the paper inside. And then for the saddle stitch, you need to punch 5 holes. So I measured 1/2 inch from the top and the bottom to make my first mark, my first 2 marks. And then I made a mark in the center and then divided that space in half and made my next 2 marks. So again, you have 5 holes. So what I'll be doing is open up the book and you'll take your scrap piece of paper that has the markings, or if you don't want to do this, you can measure directly in your book too. But I'm just going to slide this inside and line it up. Now, because I don't want this paper to move, I want those measurements there, I am going to use a binder clip to help me hold it in place. So I've got my binder clip and I'm just going to snap that down. And that'll hold it in place, so now I have a little bit more freedom of movement. Now, because I do have an awl, I'm going to use that to poke my holes. So I'm going to put it on top of the cutting mat. And I hope you can see this, and if not, I'll describe my actions. So I like to keep one side flat against the table. Now, some people have special tools that you can use to punch holes and not poke all the way through the table, but that's why we're doing it this way, because I don't have that special tool. So lay it flat, and I take my awl, and I put it against the mark that I made, and then I punch sideways, kind of at an angle. And you can see I came out the other side. So I just want to make sure that my hole is big enough for my needle to go through. So I'm just going to work it in a little bit. And you can see I have the hole coming out the back. So I'll do that again for all of my holes. So I just angle it and punch through. And you can see I'm not actually punching into the cutting mat, but it's there just in case so I don't scrape the table. And then here we are on the bottom hole. And again, just working it in a little bit so that we can make sure that our needle can get through, because the needle does go through each of these holes 2 or 3 times. So I've got the bottom all done. Now I just have 2 more to do. Again, at an angle, just punching all the way through. And if you're doing this at home and you don't have an awl, you can take your sewing needle and just push your sewing needle all the way through, at least once. You can do it a couple of times and that might help loosen the hole up too. So there we go, we have all 5 of our holes done. So I'm going to take off our binder clip and take off the markings. So there we go, we have 5 holes. So the next step is to cut our thread. So you don't need a whole lot, but I'm going to take my embroidery floss and I'm going to hold it out about there, measure from my nose to the end of my hand, and that's plenty of thread. So I'm just going to take my needle, or take my scissors, and cut that there. Okay, and now I've got, it's like an embroidery needle, so it has a thicker eye on top. You can see this is probably a little bit bigger than your normal sewing needles that you have at home, but those are fine too. So this I'm just going to thread. Oh, actually, before I do this, I want to show you why you might want some beeswax. So you use beeswax just a little bit on your thread and you run it across. If you check your mom's sewing room, they might have a little bit of wax hanging around, and you can ask too. But if you just run a little bit of this over your thread, it helps with the durability and it makes your thread last longer, which means your book will last longer. And then I just like to run it through my fingers a little bit to kind of help that wax settle in. So once you've done that, and if you don't have wax, you can skip that step. But now that I've done that, now I'll thread my needle. Here we go. Okay, and we're ready to begin sewing. So for this step, I like to start at the very center of my book. So the middle hole, I'll take my thread and I start on the inside and I go to the outside. Now when you do that, you want to make sure that you leave a tail on the inside, okay? And now from the outside, I'm going to go up to the next hole and poke into the middle again. See, and you're gonna pull it tight. So I'm holding on the inside. I'm holding that tail thread so it doesn't accidentally get pulled all the way through. And now I'm going to go up to the next hole, the one on the very end. And again, I pull that tight without letting go of the tail in the center. So now I'm going to go back down to that second hole. And again, we're going back into the middle and pull that tight. Now, where do I go next? I'm headed back out through that middle hole again. So this is the second time we're going out through the middle. And we're going to repeat the same step going back down this direction. So the next hole over, go back to the inside. And pull that tight. At this point, I can let the tail go. It's not going to slide out anymore. And so now I'm going to go up to the next hole and the last hole, poke my needle out and pull it tight. And then back in to that second hole, into the center, and pull it tight. And now we're pretty much done. So what I do next is I like to keep my knot as close to the middle as I can. So what I take is I take the blunt end of my needle and I slide underneath the stitch above it, because remember, so here we are. So you can see there's this little last gap that we're going to be closing in the middle. So I'm going to take my blunt needle side and I'm going to poke it underneath so that it closes that gap, and now I'll tie my knot. And you can tie that as tightly as you want. And I like to do a little bit of a square knot or a double knot. So I'm just going to thread that in there and finish that out. Excellent. And you can see we have plenty of extra thread, so if you cut it a little shorter, then you'll be just fine. Now we take our scissors, trim that down, and we're all done. If you'd like at this point, you can take a little bit of glue and just tack it there in the middle, just to help keep those down. But if you do, wait until it dries completely before you close the book. Otherwise, you're going to glue your pages together. So now that we've done that, our final step is to take our bone folder or pencil, and you're just going to run it along that edge, just to help sink in those stitches. And this way it helps it keep it nice and flat. And there we have our first book, the saddle stitch. Okay, so we finished our first book, the saddle stitch. Next we'll be moving on to the chain stitch. So here is our sample, and you can see this one looks a little bit more involved, and the stitch does involve a little bit more thinking and work, but it's still a simple stitch to do. Now this does have more holes than the saddle stitch, so we'll start with that. So I followed the same techniques of tapping everything together, and I used my punching guide that I had earlier for the saddle stitch, so I start with 5 holes. Now I can leave it at that if I'd like to, but I think the chain stitch looks nice with a few more holes on it and a few more stitches. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take my pencil and I'm just going to eyeball this, but you can measure it if you'd like. I'm just going to mark a space in between the holes that I already have from the 5 punches that I did for the saddle stitch. So there we go. We've got all 5 of those, or all of the new holes marked. And I'm going to take my awl, and again, keeping one edge flat to the table, I'm going to take that angle and just punch my next set of holes. And again, these are just eyeballing it in between. We're just punching those holes really fast here. And again, if you decide to use your sewing needle to punch these holes, just take your sewing needle all the way through. And the reason we do that is because the eye of the needle is just a little bit wider than the shaft, so that helps make the hole just a little bigger. So now you can see I have all of my holes punched and ready. I also went ahead and I pre-cut and pre-waxed my thread for this one. And again, this one, I just took a measurement out to my hand and maybe just a couple extra inches more. So for this one, instead of starting in the middle, we start at the very top. So you take your needle from the inside going to the outside. And you want to make sure you leave a tail. Now I need a little more maneuverability and I can't hold on to the tail, so I'm just going to use my binder clip. Now I don't want to make a mark on my paper. Excuse me while I rip some paper here. So I'm just going to take a little piece of paper and I'm going to pinch that tail with this paper, and then I'm going to use that binder clip to pinch that in place. The reason we're using some paper, and I should have done that before as well, is sometimes your binder clips or something like this might have a little bit of rust, and that can get on your paper, which would be disappointing. So now I've got my tail clamped and in place. So now that my thread is to the outside, this is tricky. We're going to pull our thread just to the side. Can you see how I'm pulling it to the side there? And I'm going to go back in the same hole I came out of into the middle. So this takes a little maneuvering, and I might not have punched my holes big enough, so I might have a harder time getting it back. But I'm going back in the same hole, and I'm going to pull it mostly tight. I want you to leave a little loop at the top there, okay? And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So now on the inside, we'll go down to the next hole and take our needle to the outside. And this first stitch, these first two stitches are just a little different, but once we get this pattern down, it'll be the same stitch for the entire thing. So we're going to take our needle and we are going to go through that loop. Okay, and now I want that loop to be tight to the top. So I'm going to take my tail from the inside, see that there? And I'm going to pull that tight so that loop on the top disappears. And now it's got that thread trapped underneath it, which is what I want. Okay? So again, we pull that tail just so it's tight and that loop on top vanished. So now I can pull this just a little tighter. And so now we're going to go back into the same hole that we just came out of, the second hole down. So I'm going to push that through to the inside. And as I pull it, you can see I have a little bit of why we call this a chain stitch. It looks like there's a little chain link right there. Makes a little loop, okay? So now we're on the inside and we're going to go to the next hole down, okay? And poke it to the outside. And now, I should have said this before, but I'm going to say it now. Always, since I'm right-handed, I always go from the right side to the left side. If you're left-handed, you may want to go from the left side to the right side. So I'm going to go underneath both of the strings from my stitch, from that chain up above. So I'm going to take my needle and slide it right underneath both of those threads and pull that tight. And then, you might have guessed it, I'm going to go back into the same hole. And that is the stitch for this book. So let me go back into the same hole I came out of and pull it nice and tight. And there you go. Can you see that I have two stitches now, two of my chain stitches? So we're going to do the same stitch on the next one. So we're going to the next stitch down, going out. And then because I'm right-handed, I'm going right to left, underneath, and pull that tight. And then I'm going to take my thread and my needle, and I'm going back in the same hole I came out of. Now, as you're going in and out of the same hole, one word of caution, and this doesn't make a big difference, but it can affect your stitch. You want to try and not go through your previous thread. So the thread coming out, you want to try and go to the side of it instead of straight through the middle, because that can affect how the stitch looks. And again, that's not super crucial, but it does have some impact. So now we're pulling it tight, and now we have 3 chain stitches. You can see this stitch might have been a little bit longer. Maybe I should have measured to make it even, but you can't tell in the end. And then that's the steps. So I'm going to go down the next one, then right to left, underneath those threads, and then back through the same hole. and pull it tight. Can you see how my threads didn't line up evenly? That's because when I went back down through, I must have poked through the thread instead of going next to it. But if you just pull and tug a little bit, you can generally straighten that out. So now I'm going through the next stitch, or the next hole, and again, right to left underneath, and back through the same hole. Oops. Pull it tight, and proceed. In to out, right to left, and back through the same hole. Pull it tight, and then from the inside going out again, underneath, right to left, then back down. Pull it tight. Okay, and now we're on the last one. So for our last stitch, it's the same thing. We go to the outside, right to left, and then back into the center. We're almost done. So now that we're back into our center, you can see we have all of our chain stitches ready. So how do I finish it off? Well, I'm going to start with the side that has my needle on it. And I'm going to take my blunt end again, and I'm going to go underneath the loop of thread above it, just like we did on the outside. And then in this loop that I've made to the side, I'm going to go through that as well, and I'm just going to tie a knot. So let's see. I might have pulled my thread a little too early here. Let me get that straightened out. Need to even my thread out again. That's what happened because I just pulled on one thread instead of all of them at the same time. So it got a little bit wonky, but we've got it even, okay? And then as you pull it tight, I like to try and keep it right up against the hole. And there we go. We can take our scissors and snip that tail off. There we go. And again, if you want to take a little glue, you can just dab that down. And then for the other side, undo the binder clip that held our tail in place. And if you'd like to, you can try and sneak it underneath with your fingernails, but I like to use my needle. So I'm just going to thread that up again real quick here. Push that underneath. And then I'll unthread my needle because I was just using that as a tool to get it under. Oop, I pulled it a little too far. There we go. We'll pull that thread back out a little bit. So I have my loop there, and we're going to tie our knot. Just pulling that in. Again, if you want to, you can do a double knot, but single knot will be just fine. Cut that tail end off. We have our book finished. Now you can see on one of my stitches on the inside, when I came back to the inside, I moved it over just a little bit. So that's why it doesn't have a completely straight line. But that's fine too, because in the end, your book is ready. So now we take our pencil or our bone folder and just run it along the fold, and our chain stitch book is complete. Okay, so we're ready for our final book. We're doing the Japanese stab binding. Now, the book that I'm going to do, I decided to do something a little bigger than this little pocket size book. So I'm taking my entire sheet here, and the measurements that I'm doing for this one are 5 by 8.5 inches. And the reason for that is because the 8.5 is the width of the paper that we use for the copy paper, or the signature inside. So I already went ahead and cut out our cover, so we'll just move that to the side. So here we've got our cover pieces, and I also went ahead and cut out the paper for the inside. Now, a Japanese stab binding is unique because you don't need to fold your paper. You can just do straight edges. If you want to fold your paper, you can, but that just adds a little bit of extra bulk. So for this one, I'm using only 10 sheets, but there was enough paper from the copy paper sheet that if I wanted, I could do up to even 20, you know, from the same paper. But I'm doing something a little bit thinner, so it's a little easier to poke my holes through. So again, I really like this kind of a dark blue navy color, so I'm going to use that for my cover on the outside. Now you want your cover and your inside paper to line up exactly. So I'm just going to sandwich my signature paper in between and again tap it out. So a Japanese stab binding is unique in that you don't necessarily have to worry about the grain line. Now it's nice to have the grain line go along the spine or the side. So a Japanese stab binding is typically a little bit shorter than it is wider. So you want the short side, the grain, to go in this direction along the spine. Okay, there we go. So I tap it and I want to make sure that right up against that edge is nice and even. Now I went ahead and I made another punching template. You can see I haven't punched my holes yet, but I'm going to line this up against that edge I want to use as my spine. And I'm just going to tap it in place, just to help keep it nice and even. It's a little hard for me doing it facing that way, so you'll just have to indulge me a moment. Okay, so once it's been tapped in place, I'm carefully going to hold it, and I'm going to take a scrap piece of paper and just kind of fold it around that edge so I can take my binder clip, whoops, and shoot it across the table. No, what you actually want to do with your binder clip is pinch and hold it in place. Now, I really like to use a binder clip, or you can use a laundry clip. Let's see if you have, well, anything that'll pinch and hold it in place. Like a clothespin would work too. So I'm just gonna pinch that and fold those down so it can lay a little more flat. And I'm going to leave these binder clips in place the entire time here. So now just give it another once over, make sure your edges are lined up, and then don't forget your cutting board, because this time you will be poking down with your awl. And again, you can use your needle, but you're going to have a tough time, so you'll want to make sure you make your hole big enough for your needle to go through at least 3 times. So I have my holes marked, and I'm going to be doing 5 holes for this Japanese stab binding. And this is a very simple design. If you look it up, there's a lot of complicated ones, but we're just doing something simple today. So I'm just going to take my awl, line it up, and punch down into that hole. Now, you can see I did come out the other end a little bit, but because this mat doesn't have too much give, you can't go very deep. So now that I've got the initial hole, I'm going to just put my fingers, put my fingers on either side of the awl so I'm not stabbing myself. And I'm just going to slowly work my way, and you can see the point of my awl coming out the other side. I'm just going to work my way to make sure that I have enough room for my needle to go through. Okay, so again, I'm just going to get it started by punching straight down, a little bit of force there, and again, fingers on either side. I'm just going to help hold it in place, hold the paper in place so I can work my awl into that hole to make it nice and a big opening for the needle. Do that again. Until all of your holes are punched through. Now you can do this with any number of holes, but I like how 5 holes looks. I think an odd number looks very nice. Okay, and now we've got our last hole. So again, punch down to get it started, and then finish by poking all the way through. Okay, and there we have our holes. Now I don't really feel like punching or sewing this guide on top of it, so I'm going to just loosen my binder clips a little bit so I can take that out. But I also want to leave the binder clips in place just to keep everything together as I stitch. So I've got my hands gripping it firmly so I can pull the punching guide out. And then I've got, again, I'm using just scrap pieces of paper underneath my binder clip, and that just helps keep my paper, my covers clean, so they're less likely to get imprints or marks from the binder clip. Okay, so now that we have our holes punched, it's time to use our thread. So I've already pre-cut my thread, but I measured it out about twice an arm length with just a little extra. I also ran it through my wax, again for extra durability. and just ran it through my fingers to help it soak in. Okay, now I'm a fan of starting in the middle, so we're going to start in the middle of this one just like we did for the first. So because this one doesn't have a difference on covers, I'm just going to say this is my top. So I'm going to start in the very middle and go down and out the back. Now I want to make sure that I keep that tail, so I might just put it underneath that arm of the binder clip. And that's just enough to help hold it in place so it doesn't get lost. Now, the Japanese stab binding involves a wrapped spine. And that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call this a wrap. So we're going to go from the outside of the spine, and we're going to go back down through the same hole that we just started with, okay? So we're going to wrap the spine. So I always wrap the spine first in every new hole. So you can see I'm on the back side again. So from the back side, I'm going to move up to the next hole. See? So now my thread is on top. So I'm going to take this straight out to that spine, and I'm going to wrap the spine again. Okay, and now that I'm on the back side, I'm going to go back through the same hole in the same direction. We're going to pull that tight. Okay, so we're back on the front again. Okay, and now I'm going to move over to the next hole. Okay, so we're going up to this corner. We're going to pull that tight. And now we're going to wrap the spine. So you come back from the back side, wrap it around that spine, and you're going to go straight down through the hole again. Whoops, see, it wants to move, but I want it to wrap around the spine in that direction. There we go. Okay, now you might ask yourself, how do I get back? Well, you can start back this direction, but I like to wrap the top edge too. Can you see that? Instead of going straight back down to the next hole, I wrap it around the outside edge, or the top of the book. And we're going to go back down through that hole again. Oops, it wants to move. There we go, and pull it tightly. And there you can see we've got kind of a nice little framed corner. So now we're on the back side, and we're going to fill in that gap. See, there's that hole right there. We're going to take our needle and go back to the front from the back. And there we go. See, we filled in that hole, and now we're on the front. And can you guess where we're going next? That's right, we're going to fill in that hole. So we'll go back to the back side. And now from here, we're going to do this side. So we're going to go to the front in that hole. And then, as you recall, I like to wrap the spine first. So we're going to wrap the spine by going back through the same hole and wrap the spine. Now we're going to go up to this last hole. We're going to the back of the book, and we're going to take the thread and wrap the spine and go straight down again through. You want to make sure you keep it so it wraps the spine first. There we go. And then we're going to turn our book to the side. See how I do that? Just a simple turn. And we're going to wrap that side edge again. So I'm going to hold it with my pointer finger, and I'm going back through that hole. And then pull it tight. And now we've got a nicely framed corner again. So on the back side, we're going back through that hole next to it, and we're going to finish that gap. Okay, pull it tight. And then on the front, we're back at the beginning again. So for this one, I'm going to loosen my thread from the beginning, and we're going to tie a knot. So for this one, I don't like to take my thread underneath the loops like we've done before. We're just going to tie a simple knot. Now, as we're tying this knot, you want to try and do it so it fits, the knot comes right into that middle hole. You can tie your knot here, but then you'll have a knot on the front of your book or the back of your book. Depends on how you want to flip it. So I like to keep it as much in that middle as I can. And for this one, I do a double knot. So I'll take this and make another knot here. And again, kind of pull it tight so it sits right above that hole. And then I'm going to take my thread. You can see I still am on this side of the book. I'm going to take it and I'm going to thread it down through that hole, just behind the knot. I'm going to move my thread so I can get behind the knot. I'm going to come out the back. Okay, and doing this kind of helps pull that thread and that knot into the middle of your book instead. Okay, so now I'm on the back side of the book, and I'm just going to trim that thread right up against the edge. Okay, and you can do the same thing with this side if you'd like to, but since I've already pulled one thread through, I think this one will be just fine. And if you want to, you can take just a touch of glue, just a little dot, and just put a little dot on that knot, and it'll help keep it in place. We'll take off our binding clips. And our book is done. You can see we don't need a bone folder or anything, and this book is ready for us to go. This is a really good stitch for something that you need single sheets of. For example, if you have a sketchbook that you'd like to make, you can use this stitch. If you have a simple little photo album that you'd like to share, just a bunch of single photos next to each other, you can bind them together like this. And so that concludes our bookbinding tutorial. So we have the saddle stitch, the most basic and simple stitch with 5 holes. We have our chain stitch, which is just the next step up. And then finally, the Japanese stab. Thank you for joining us today.